people can read about something or see something on YouTube or hear about something and go to Spotify or go to Apple Music or any of the others and listen for themselves. That can be good. The algorithms say you like this, so you'll probably like this. If you listen to my show, I say if you like this, you probably never heard of this, and the algorithms don't know about it, but try it out. And that's the value, I think, of an actual programmer or a host, and that's what we need.
Hey everybody, Mike Jeffers. Welcome to Chicago Music Revealed, another special episode. Here we are covering the International Jazz Day festivities here in Chicago. And I am very happy to have Grammy Award-winning journalist, radio host, music critic, author, and just a jazz enthusiast for many, many years, Neil Tesser, to be on the show.
Just want to see who you were talking about there. I wasn't quite sure.
Well, like I told you before we came on, you and I could talk for like 4 hours about everything that I'd love to talk to you about. But we're going to try to focus here on this great panel that's coming up April 26th, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at the Cultural Center, Jazz Life, Celebration of History of Jazz Radio in Chicago. You are one of the panelists. Of course, this is Mark Ruffin's brainchild here that he's put together. And when I had him on last week, Neil, I was talking to him a little bit. And the one thing I couldn't understand is how is he going to have a panel which also includes Barry Winograd, Dave Freeman, Bert Berdine, of course, Mark Ruffin, a myriad of other people. How's anybody going to get a word in edgewise, because there's a bunch of radio and DJ hosts up there with tons of stories, tons of history there. And to cover it all in 2 hours is going to be very incredible to experience. So Neil, thanks for jumping on, and let's talk a little bit about this. You were on many different radio stations over the years, but you've hosted several jazz shows that I'm very familiar with, BEZ obviously, and then Miles Ahead, and then something with Mark Ruffin. Well, both of those were Mark Ruffin. Talk a little bit about how you've seen the evolution of jazz radio just in Chicago specific, because there's such a history of it.
Yeah, I didn't grow up here in Chicago, so a lot of that is I'm getting secondhand. I came to college in 1969 and did college radio. Right after college, I was doing what was supposed to be a brokered time program with three other downbeat writers. It was called Straight No Chaser. It was on the old WNIB, weekend evenings. I say it was supposed to be brokered because we never sold any ads, and after 2.5 years, I said to the owners, we can't pay you. I don't know what to do. We're going to stop doing this. And she said, well, we never expected you to be able to pay us. We just liked having you here. But that was the first thing. And then a few years later, 6 years later, WBEZ. But in terms of how jazz radio has progressed, I was aware when I was here that there were a couple of AM stations doing jazz, and that there had been, and I think probably into the early 70s, WSDM, the Playboy radio station, with the women hosts. I believe that was still going around then, and then they all started to fade out as commercial jazz stations have done pretty much all over the country. So for much of the time that I was on WBEZ, between, what was that, 1979 and 1996, I think that we were the main game in town, certainly on the FM dial. There were a lot of intriguing radio hosts on AM, or at least a few still left, on smaller stations, mostly on the south side, although they could be heard often throughout the city. Those were somewhat burdened by commercials, and we weren't at WBEZ. I was able to play all kinds of pretty outside music, which we had also done on that earlier show called Straight No Chaser, which pissed off a lot of people, but I felt it was important to get that music out there. And as WBEZ sort of cemented its reputation, I think it became the main home for public radio listeners and others. Certainly there were lots of people, especially on the south and west sides, listening to the AM station programs, I know. But BEZ pretty much took jazz off the air in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I was already gone by then. There haven't been new AM stations popping up to play jazz, and some of those other shows or stations have disappeared as the hosts have retired or passed away. And so in terms of how jazz radio has developed, after BEZ, I think there was a dearth. A lot of people complained about it.
Yeah.
I did some other things, and the one that you mentioned, Miles Ahead, was an afternoon drive time AM radio show on the AM dial that a friend of mine from college who'd always wanted to put jazz on the radio went ahead and brokered the time. And after we'd done it a little, I'd done it a little while, we decided to expand it. Mark Ruffin came on during the earlier part. And during those handoffs from Mark to me, our benefactor decided that we had a good chemistry. Mark and I have been friends since 1979. So out of that came this syndicated talk show called Listen Here, which was, we wanted to be like the Car Guys or Siskel and Ebert, but on jazz. And it was syndicated. We did it for a few years, so that was good. But in terms of how jazz radio has developed in the city, I think it mirrors what's gone on all over the country. There were few enough commercial stations by the 70s and certainly the 80s all around. The public radio stations had been a main repository for jazz programming, and then they all started to go more and more news. So, there's not a lot of jazz radio terrestrially, but of course, Sirius Radio came along that Mark Ruffin is involved with. So I think that has sort of become the development of jazz radio. It lacks the local touch, and so when you do find local setups, it's kind of a blessing.
Yeah, I mean, WDCB, obviously 90.9 FM has kept that
Yep,
going, but that's really the only one. I mean, WHPK, has their programming on the south side. I think it's staggered a little bit now. Northwestern has a little bit, but their signal's pretty weak. So, I mean, 90.9
yep,
FM, thank God they're around. And, I've been telling people as I've been talking, doing these interviews, is that when I came back to school, from college, from music school, and I'd be driving at home, listening to Larry Smith at 1 o'clock in the morning, and he'd have a cast of characters coming in from the Jazz Showcase or whatever other gigs
right.
were around. And I mean, you just don't get that anymore. But that was like one of the places that I would hear like an Eric Alexander, or I'd hear different people that I had no idea who they were. We didn't have the internet. I mean, you're out in Chicago, you're seeing that, Ray Brown, the bigger names, but you don't know some of these up and coming ones, or some of the, George Garzone or somebody like that. I had no idea who that was until I heard it on the radio. I think a lot of this generation and a little younger generations have no concept of that because they can just go on YouTube, they go on Spotify, they can find things. But talk a little bit about that aspect of it, because I think that part of the history of jazz radio, it was so important for artists that are in New York, Kansas City, anywhere in the country, to be heard other places in the country and get a name for themselves to be able to come there and perform. Without jazz radio, it wouldn't have happened.
It's absolutely true. I mean, that's how most people have traditionally found out about new artists. Now, with streaming, and you're able to get Sirius Radio. And I'm sorry that I left out WDCB as we wound around there, but of course that has easily replaced WBEZ as a source of all-day radio with a lot of knowledgeable hosts, and so that's a great thing. But I think not everybody drives anymore, and everybody's listening to podcasts and streaming. I don't know how often people are listening to the radio per se. I know WDCB does a great job, and I think they have a good listenership. But around the country, I'm not so sure. So yes, that's a drawback. On the other hand, people can read about something or see something on YouTube or hear about something and go to Spotify or go to Apple Music or any of the others and listen for themselves. That can be good. The algorithms say you like this, so you'll probably like this. If you listen to my show, I say if you like this, you probably never heard of this, and the algorithms don't know about it, but try it out. And that's the value, I think, of an actual programmer or a host. And that's what we need.
That's one of the things that I was going to bring up next too, is that, listening to you on the radio or listening to Larry Smith or Dick Buckley or any of them, I would hear things that I would never hear, and you would play them. And even if I went somewhere else, I probably wouldn't hear it because you've got your ears on certain things that other people don't have. Just as part of being a journalist and being a radio host, you're hearing things, people are sending you stuff. I think that aspect of the jazz radio is sort of lost now because you don't have that person on the radio that you're listening to who's saying, hey, check this out. I heard this because of this, and I love this album. I mean, that little push behind somebody on the air saying, man, I really dig this, check this out, could change somebody's career a little bit and get them a little bit more listenership. And I think that's sort of lost these days with the streaming stuff.
I agree. There's no water cooler, there's no central town square where we all listen or watch the same things. It's all been split up, balkanized into, atomized into little audiences. So that's a problem. I agree. You just try to get the word out as much as you can. It's one reason I'm fortunate to be doing this program that I am doing now from Chicago that's on in San Diego. There's a station in San Diego called KSDS that's been doing jazz for a while. They have a full schedule all day, but they instituted, let's see, I just started myself 4 years ago. They instituted a program block called Jazz Across America, and each night, Monday through Friday, they have a host from a different city doing a program as they asked me to do, as if I was talking to our listeners here.
Yeah.
So people in San Diego will, for instance, tomorrow night it's on, they'll be hearing me talk about all the people playing in Chicago leading up to International Jazz Week. And there are Chicago listeners because they can stream it here, but in San Diego, it's on the radio. You could hear it in your car. And I think it's an attempt to give people, listeners in their part of the world, a sense of what radio, that kind of on the ground local radio that you're talking about, is like around the country.
I was going to bring that up actually. Isn't it? You're on from 5 to 7 p.m. Is that in Chicago time or is that San
No,
Diego
that's
time?
out. That's out there.
Okay.
So
So
you
two
know,
hours, 2 hours the other direction for us. So seven to 9, which is a good time slot for us to be able to listen to you. I think that's a great concept too. I'm surprised more stations like that haven't done that because if they can hook up with people all across the country, first of all, it gives such a variety to their broadcast, day. And also you bring in experts on just like yourself, having a weekly show, talking about the radio and talking about the panel, of course, that's coming up April 26th, Sunday at the Cultural Center, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Jazz Life Celebration of History of Jazz Radio in Chicago. And by the way, RSVPs for tickets is recommended because it's going to get packed. So I'll link everything up down below. Be sure to RSVP before you go to the Cultural Center, find out you can't get into the panel because it's going to be packed, I'm sure. They're also going to be taking questions from the crowd, which should be an interesting back and forth. And we'll see. I'm sure there's a lot of people, a lot of memories about jazz radio in Chicago and the history of jazz and everything. Now, Neil, you do a lot of liner notes too for artists. So you listen to a lot of music and people reach out to you and you write a lot of different liner notes in addition to writing for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Downbeat, and a myriad of other publications. But specifically,
but I don't do any of that anymore.
oh, you
Pretty
don't.
much the only writing I, pretty much the only writing I do is online notes. The reader has no budget. I could write for them for free, but I don't always have time. The other daily papers have almost all cut back on their jazz coverage. I haven't been writing for the magazines for one reason or another. I was writing for Jazz Is, which is now functionally defunct.
Yeah.
It's a shell now. And so I found that somewhat satisfying. I get to usually spend a little more time than I would on an article with an artist to write the liner notes. Some people have a problem with that. They say, "Oh, you're a shill. You're just writing what they want you to write." I just don't do that. If I don't lie on the notes. If I say something I think is really good, it's because I think it, and if not, it's a chance to let the artist really express himself or herself about their music in a meaningful way. So I actually that's the writing I've been doing lately.
That's well, it's not a shocker to me owning Chicago Jazz Magazine and stopping the publication of it and just taking everything online and kind of going a different direction to be able to
Sure.
cover the scene, but just monetarily it wasn't feasible at a certain point. So I get it with all the other publications, but with the writing of the liner notes, I know we still get a lot of CDs and a lot of reviews sent into our way, and the ability for an artist to put a recording out and get some sort of push behind it is getting tougher and tougher and tougher because there just aren't the publications, there aren't those vehicles. But what I find with your writing in those liner notes, I think it's essential. I mean, people can criticize you for what you just mentioned, but I think it's essential because, inevitably some of those liner notes get put up online, get passed around, get put into the reviews, like we do some of that over at chicagojazz.com. And that's one of the only ways people can really learn about the artist and learn about the recording is by having a definitive liner note written about their recording. Otherwise, it would just be you're just putting singles out, and nobody would know anything other than whether or not they like that. There's no relationship between the artist and the listener.
I should say that there's only been about one person who actually had that criticism about liner note writers being shills, and I should also add that he never was asked to write any, so that may have had something to do with it. But I know exactly what you're saying. As so many people, I mean, I did. I assume you did as well. We learned about what we were listening to from reading vinyl records liner notes, and
Right.
I remember I can quote certain liner notes that I read when I was first starting to listen to music because they made such an impression on me and really shaped my listening. So yeah, I do think it's essential. At one point, when the Grammys were trying to cut down on this, there's a lot of Grammy Awards. There's like 85 of them, and it had grown to about 120 at one point, and they were looking for things to cut out. And I actually suggested, because I was took off my jazz hat. I was on a committee with the Grammys. I said, well, you could get rid of liner notes. And there was an outcry from other people saying, no, you can't do that, which I was gratified to see. I mean, I was just throwing it out there as a flyer. But a lot of people besides us, these were people who were not big jazz fans, but, you know, R&B people,
Yeah,
pop
yeah,
people who
yeah.
said, no, we need those. So when we do pick up on someone like John Coltrane, we have a sense of why it's important, even what influence it might have had on other forms of music decades later.
Yeah.
So yes, I think liner notes are valuable.
I know that when you were on the radio too, it helped when you were reading liner notes about about a recording that you like what it sounds like, but you don't have any background on anything. It's sitting right there, which really helps create that relationship between the listener and the artist, and that's why I think it's essential too.
Yeah.
So last question for you. Of course, Neil Tesser is going to be part of this Jazz Life celebration of jazz radio in Chicago, history of jazz radio in Chicago, April 26th, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at the Cultural Center. I mean, did you just, somebody say, hey, Neil, you should be on the radio, you're on the radio? Was there somebody that you listened to, that you got motivated by, that you sort of said, you know what, I'm going to I like that style, this sort of is impressing me a little bit. I'm going to do it this direction and act this way a little bit on the radio.
We got a couple of minutes here, right?
Yeah, oh, yeah, sure.
Might be a longer answer.
Okay.
I recently ran across some recordings of myself doing that program Straight No Chaser in 1973, 74 and 75. And I can't believe how faux serious I sounded. Now the show didn't start till 11:30, so it was a little low energy. We had a background music bed. I mean, it's definitely an artifact of its time. But what I really heard when I was first starting getting into jazz in high school, this was in New York, and the main station there was a station called WRVR, which stood for Riverside, which was up where it is. That's a northern part of Manhattan. I think it's just actually north of Harlem, if I remember. And there was a fellow on there named Ed Beach who had this big, deep voice. And he was on, I think, for only an hour a night, at most two. And he would do deep dives into one artist. And he was the quintessential Clint Eastwood in Play Misty for Me, laid back, cool, just this and everything he said, there was no mumbling, there was no mumbo jumbo. He was just speaking clearly, cleanly, as if he was talking to you in a bar with loads of information, which is how I started learning about a lot of these artists. But I still wasn't that much into jazz when I got to college. In fact, I was doing a classical music program my first year at WNUR, the Northwestern station.
Mm-hmm.
And I came back sophomore year, and we had a new program director, a fellow named Al Lerner, who went on to become sort of a broadcasting legend in Chicago. And they were doing the program grid, and I came in. I said, well, I'd like to do my classical music show. He said, no, we've given that away to this woman, who later became the rock critic for the Chicago Tribune. I said, well, what about me? He said, well, we have a jazz slot open on Friday nights. I said, well, I only know a little about jazz. He said, well, there's the record library. Go learn. So I went over. I took an assumed name because in my youthful college naivete and self-assuredness and, complete, you're in a bubble. I thought, well, I'll just do this for 1 quarter. And when I go back to doing my my classical show, I don't want them to know who it was because I'll have made so many mistakes. That's how you think when you're an idiot at 19. And so I started doing that, but within a couple of months, I had really fallen in love with jazz. And that's really, I mean, he set me on that direction unknowingly. And I got more and more into it. And that's how that happened. But in terms of patterning myself, the other person I got to hear a lot was a fellow named Harry Abraham. It was a station in Rochester called WHAM, which was a clear channel station. I don't know if you know what that is. The viewers know, but early in the FCC's life, when they started assigning frequencies to different cities, they had to limit the amount of power so that they weren't all running into each other. So when you went to turn in a certain station, you didn't get five of them. But they designated, was it seven, nine, maybe 11 stations that had been there a long time as clear channel, which meant that at night they could broadcast to their full power and they could reach many states. This was in Rochester, New York, but we could hear it in Chicago. So I used to listen to that guy, and I used to call him on Sunday nights after my own radio show and shoot the breeze with him. And he was another really laid back, deep voiced guy. So I got a sense of it being sort of a cool thing to do, but I never really tried to sound like those guys because I didn't have those deep pipes. So I just kind of, I think, forged my own way with it.
I'm glad you took the time to tell us that because those were great stories. And it's one of those things where you found your own voice doing it's literally your own voice, but you got inspired by certain people but really it comes back to all that knowledge that they're sharing too on there, which obviously is what you are known for. And I'm
I hope
looking
so.
forward to having you on this panel because it's going
Yeah,
to be very exciting to sit in the audience and listen to all the stories and listen to the back and forth with everybody and everything else. So Neil, thanks so much for jumping on with me. I really appreciate it. And I
me
know I'm going
too.
to see you this summer at the festivals and everything else. So it's good to see you here virtually, but we'll see you in person very soon as well.
And I'm glad for the opportunity as well because for it's silly, we don't make time to talk to each other very much, even though we're a couple miles apart. So we'll try to fix that in the next year.
100%, 100%. Of course, everybody, all the information is on chicagojazz.com. And as I always say, hopefully I will see somebody out on the scene.